Gamers love to fight. Sometimes being a fan of something means you're supposed to be an enemy of something else. Since each countdown deliberation is its own gaming debate, we figured it was time to pick the most prominent disagreements in games. Without picking sides, we pondered the biggest battles that have ever surfaced in the industry, whether they're franchises, consoles, companies, genres, or playstyles. We ranked them by relevance in the modern era, so some of these arguments used to make a lot of noise, but have since been silenced.
Hey guy, you're the first serious gamer I've seen all morning. Check this out.
Until the 16-bit era, there wasn't much reason to care whether your friends had an Atari or an NES or a Master System. But then Sega loudly declared its superiority, and thus the console wars began. Of course, the Genesis was better than the NES, but Sega also went on the offensive against Nintendo's superior 16-bit successor by introducing Sonic the Hedgehog and dubious claims of blast processing. Fans on both sides dug in and began learning about tech specs, debating everything from colors to audio. Game Gear made Game Boy look ancient, and Nintendo's attempt to stay family-friendly cost them when Mortal Kombat was censored on the Super NES. Nintendo was set to counter the Sega CD with plans for a similar add-on, but soured business relationships turned the PlayStation into a rival that would give both companies a run for their money. Before that transition, Sega's focus on new hardware add-ons eventually handicapped the company, while historic games like Super Metroid, Donkey Kong Country, and Chrono Trigger made their way to the Super NES. In the end, Nintendo won the battle for the generation, but players still fight for each side to this day. Fans decry the lack of local split-screen support in Halo 5, and with just cause. Halo campaigns were, to this point, considered one of the last bastions of a now seemingly dying game mode. Developers have openly addressed the lack of split-screen in contemporary games, pointing to stretched resources and compromised processing power. For some gamers, being able to play online with friends, or strangers for that matter, makes local co-op seem trivial. Developing a split-screen mode potentially detracts from time that could be spent on multiplayer or a refined single-player experience. But many feel like local play encourages non-competitive co-op. Indie games like Screen Cheat, Guacamelee, and Gang Beasts are stepping up, providing some of the most unique and fun couch co-op experiences out there, whereas more AAA fodder like Borderlands, Resident Evil Revelations, Rock Band, and much of Nintendo's catalog carry the torch. The debate between disc versus digital games is a relatively new one, considering the success of Steam and Xbox Live. They each have their pros and cons, with disc purists enjoying their tangible growing collection and the ability to resell used games. Digital lovers enjoy being able to play the exact moment a game releases, and even believe games run faster, despite evidence to the contrary. It's a war that may end sooner rather than later, thanks to the ever-increasing push of digital media, but there are still enough warriors on both sides to make it an issue that continues to evolve from game to game. When it comes to Dota 2 versus League of Legends, we've seen very little middle ground. Those that prefer one over the other tend to extol the virtues of their choice and condemn the opposite. The intense popularity of each game increases the stakes compared to other well-known franchise rivalries. Regardless of which game you pick, it's hard to feel like you've made a mistake. Dota 2 offers its entire roster for free, and we've spent well over 1,000 hours in the game without spending a dime. On the other hand, League of Legends is considerably easier to get into, and new champions are added regularly. Be wary, however, the communities of both games have a well-earned reputation for being less than friendly. Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat are essentially fighting game royalty at this point. Both are so influential and popular, it's hard imagining the genre existing as it is today without them. Even so, they couldn't be more different from one another. Street Fighter prides itself on a cast of worldly warriors and dazzling super moves. Mortal Kombat is as violent as games come, with notoriously brutal fatalities. As far as the competitive scene is concerned, Street Fighter is and always will be a main event, the bread and butter of the entire community. Yet Mortal Kombat is no slouch either, with Mortal Kombat X developing its own sizable scene. Final Fantasy has seen ample success as a franchise that has spanned almost 30 years, multiple genres, and nearly every generation of consoles. But we'd be hard-pressed to find a franchise that has more disparity among its own fans on which title is their favorite. The simple notion of asking which is best among Final Fantasy fans can often turn into a tirade, driving wedges between friends who think 7 outshines 6, that 11 and 14 don't deserve Roman numeral status, or how 13 is vastly underrated. Most popular RPG series come down to one or two favorites, but you can make a compelling argument that any Final Fantasy game is better than all the others. Well, any game except 2. Although they both share the same theme and aesthetic of an online military shooter, these two juggernaut franchises couldn't stand further apart. Call of Duty's emphasis on twitch-based accuracy is a drastically different pace than Battlefield's large-scale tactical conquests. The main point of contention usually revolves around which game requires more skill, but the truth is that they both demand different skill sets. The bitter battle wages even further with splintered factions of PC loyalists touting their rigs as the one true way to play. The fighting has no end in sight, with the recent release of Battlefield Hardline and Call of Duty Black Ops 3 adding more fuel to this raging war. At some point in the past few years, the word free has become something that gamers don't want to see printed on their most anticipated games, because it usually means there's a catch. The question still looms over the industry. Is it better to make people pay full price for a product that might include things they don't want, or break up the experience and let consumers pay for what they do want? What's the harm in giving some people access to your game at no cost, while allowing hardcore fans to throw as much money at you as they wish? There's no right answer, as publishers struggle to find that perfect equation. The PC began as the only way to game, only to be surpassed by machines that brought the gaming community together on common, marketable ground. In the decades that followed, the PC has cut against the grain, while the console crowd enjoyed the nearly undivided attention of the industry. The conflict has driven a gap between the two sides of the gaming community that sometimes even refuse to make eye contact. The front lines of each skirmish is performance, as it's hard to argue that a top-of-the-line PC won't always run better than any game on a console. Whether the investment is ultimately worth it is where many egos have fought and perished. Much like the Hatfields and the McCoys, these are two families that may never bury the hatchet. A lot of these title bouts aren't as big of a draw as they used to be, but this rumble has been raging ever since Microsoft entered the console market 14 years ago. One company is known for software, the other hardware, and both have had their ups and downs when trying to capture the hearts of the couch-bound gaming audience. Both of them are obviously competing against Nintendo as well, but Sony and Microsoft have such similar goals that they seem like natural adversaries. East versus West, blue versus green. Sony seems to have taken the lead this generation, but Microsoft is not out of the race yet. We're still waiting to see if one of them gets knocked entirely out of the ring. Don loops the staff through his latest creative concoction in Super Mario Maker, the Mobius Strip, in another strenuous episode of Don's Design Lab. And we called out the many faults at play in Mario Tennis Ultra Smash in our full review. We'll see you next week for another GT Countdown.